Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am your gracious host, Captain Frodo, and as always, thanks for tuning in. Now, again this week, I have become aware of new fruits in creative output from artists and showfolk around the world. That's a direct result of this great contraction or this great pause, this time that has been given to us by the pandemic. One of the people I've discovered is someone who's got a YouTube channel who's called Unusual as Usual. It's a fella from the UK called Johnny Strange, and he's been putting out all these excellent short biographical video films about different sideshow stars and sideshow artists, and I was drawn to his episode on Rasmus Nielsen, the famous Scandinavian muscle man that I talked about in briefly in a spiel in the episode. Where was that? That was in Clown Truth. Anyway, this Rasmus Nielsen character turns out to be a really interesting guy, and this was the first time I had actually seen moving images, footage of this very unusual fellow. Beautiful. In the end, he actually donates all of his estate and his money to an orphanage, and good pal all around, and which is strange because he's heavily tattooed, huge piercings and stuff, which was unusual in the 30s and 40s. I was also thrilled to learn that my friend Mitch was writing a novel. That's all very exciting. Great stuff that's coming out, because the pandemic has attacked our ability to go on as usual. But as my coming gig in Denmark is looking more and more perilous, because there's been a recent flare-up of the pest there, so close to where I'm going. So all of this, the fact that it looks like I will be having to go into 10 days of quarantine at the end of the gig, it makes it seem like gigs like we used to do it, even when they can only sell half the tickets and all of that, they are still vestiges of another world and another time. We're still very far away from being on the other side of this, and I would say that we are still on the descent. It will take a lot longer before we see the bottom of this. The place that I have moved to in Norway, where I'm living now, is in the heart of Norway's fjord lands. Fjord, for those who don't know, is been created in the Ice Age, the thick ice that covered Norway and the northern parts of the world about 10,000 years ago. As that was moving, it carved these channels into the bedrock, and some of these are incredibly long. It might be 100 kilometers long, so the shortest, but not so far across, and the shortest way across is sometimes like a 20-minute ferry ride, but it could be a 4 or 5 or 6 hour drive to get around it. But now we've got a lot of tunnels here that goes beneath the fjords, but some of these fjords are like a kilometer deep. So imagine just how thick and heavy the ice had to be to carve such channels in the bedrock. But these tunnels, they go steeply downwards, and depending on how wide they are at their mouth, these subsea tunnels, the light does follow you a certain part of the way, but at some point that light from the outside is gone. And now, of course, we have electric lights inside the tunnels, but if we turned off that light, the descent would become dark very soon. And at some point on that descent, you would finally reach this flattening out, which is what happens in the tunnels. You've driven down, maybe you've driven for 20 minutes, and then it gets totally flat. And in the dark, we would only barely be able to make that out from the illumination of our headlights, and we would feel it in our bodies that it had flattened. But Taking it back to the pandemic, I don't think that the pandemic tunnel, we've even reached this bottom plateau yet. We're in the dark and we're still going downwards. But then back to the underwater tunnels, eventually as you're flattened, we know that it will go back up again. But it's still a long drive, and you might have to drive quite a while before you can even see the light up ahead at the mouth of the tunnel on the other side. The light is there and it never actually went away. We carry that as the enthusiasm inside ourselves for what we do. But that analogy, I think we are still in the dark and we're heading into more dark, and the transformations that are happening that I'm sort of been talking about the last couple of episodes of projects that other people have done, I think these are very interesting, and it might be where we will find ourselves for the next little bit, because the new normal for us entertainers is very far away. We must strap ourselves in for the long haul. We will begin to climb, and we will see the light again, and the day shall come when we again shall grace the stages of the world. But that day is not today, and it's not next week, not in any meaningful way. We must make our meaning in other ways. So in one way, it's the end of the world, but when I go outside in the sun, or the European Norwegian summer, and I even swam in a lake the other day, which is also the lake that we drink. It's our drinking water, and I see from there horses grazing in the light, leafy forests, and feel the clean water against my body as I shiver when I first submerge myself into it. It's hard to believe there is a pandemic and that the world is collapsing, and this is, of course, because in many ways the world, the natural world all around us, is doing better than ever. The fact that we don't fly as much, we drive a whole lot less, and factories are shut down, all this has led to a significant decrease in CO2 release. I just saw this article about India, and they're there inside the world's largest lockdown. There are no flights, passenger trains, no taxis, and only a few functioning industries. But one thing is remarkably abundant, and that is cleaner air. There's some incredible pictures online for India's before and after pictures, where you can, after they've had notoriously bad air pollution, the speed of the change has apparently surprised even the experts, who say that this is proof that dramatic improvements in air quality can be achieved very fast, even if it has had an enormous human and economic cost. But all around us, the world is doing just fine. The problems that we have are human. They're artificial, as we have already talked about. It's problems made for humans, made by humans for humans. But as I mentioned, this unusual, as usual, the videos online, and Mitch with his writing of a novel, so many more of these pandemic constrictions. It's the constrictions and what that is doing to our creative force and our creative outlets is very fascinating to me, because it's forcing us, the lockdowns and everything is forcing us to spend more time alone. But then that made me think that this is one of the points of advice that's given in Austin Kleon's excellent little book called Steal Like an Artist. Point 9 out of the 10 points that he says in that book is be boring. It's the only way to get things done. And in a way, these lockdowns, they can feel like a curse. And I'm thinking of Melbourne here. Melbourne got their taste of freedom only to get it taken back, and then some, with curfews and whatnot, so you can't go out, and only 1 hour to go for a walk, and you can't. It's a scary thing. But this might happen to any of us, anywhere in the world. No one is safe, and solitude and separation will be forced upon us and forced by law. And we must seize the opportunity that this is. Time is, as many has pointed out, it's a resource. Time is money, people say. But even though at this point money is possibly our exact problem, we are all artists. All artists, we're all facing that same situation. But there might be a kind of silver lining to this, because we are now unencumbered by the restraints that are making that we have to make economically viable art. In this time that has been given to us, we can create and explore a little more, because we can't make money in the normal way. And all of this makes me think of this excellent quote by Alan Watts. And you can find this on YouTube. It's very nice. It's from an hour-long talk, but it's called "What Would You Do If Money Were No Object?" And the piece goes something like, what would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life? Well, it's so amazing. As the result of our kind of educational system, crowds of students say, well, we'd like to be painters, we'd like to be poets, we'd like to be writers, but as everybody knows, you can't earn any money that way. What do you want to do? And when we finally got down to something which the individual says he really wants to do, I will say to him, or Alan Watts would say to them, you do that and forget the money. Because if you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing, which is stupid. Better to have a short life that is full of that which you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way. And after all, if you do really like what you're doing, and it doesn't really matter what that is, you can eventually become a master of it. It's the only way of becoming the master of something, to be really with it. And then you'll be able to get a good fee for whatever it is. So don't worry too much. Somebody is interested in everything. Anything you can be interested in, you'll find others who are. And so therefore, it is so important to consider this question: what do I desire? Alan Watts said that. I'll post a link in the show notes. But of course, for us, many of us, or maybe all of us, Showfolk, we were already doing what we really like doing. But money was part of that equation. What we do now, when the whole craft of showmanship or putting on shows is all gone, we have to reevaluate everything. We have to reevaluate what we do creatively and also money-wise. But this separation of money and art is an interesting thing. It might free us up to do things that we never thought was possible before. Because ultimately we must hunker down and prepare to live on a whole lot less. We must set ourselves up in a place where our creative invigoration and enthusiasm for creation, which can be practically free, or it can certainly be done cheaply, and this can then maybe make up for the fact that we've moved into a share house or warehouse, or we've traveled back to somewhere to live with family, everything to keep the costs down. But in this time, and in times like this, with great social upheaval, with chaos all around and the world changing, we need some inner development. Great society upheaval needs deep inner development. We need to look into ourselves and find out what's really important, and maybe live financially poor but emotionally rich and creatively rich. Yeah, so to finish this rant, which was meant to be motivational, I'll leave you with Tolkien's words from Lord of the Rings, since I do feel that this lockdown time, the quarantine time, the time given to us by not being able to go to work, really seems similar to the times suffered by Frodo Baggins, that is, in his quest to dispose of the ring in Lord of the Rings. The ring, the one ring to find them, the one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And the quote, which is so apt for our time, goes like this. Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." So, fellow travelers, showfolk, showmen, showgirls, and all of you beautiful people out there, go out, do amazing things with your time. Time is a precious gift. My precious. But with that, let's take a step over into the world of ideas. Sexual selection and carnival attractions. Now, I like making things up. I love making things up. And it's been what I've done for a job my whole life. And when making up an act, you can, of course, just make something up completely. Like, here we are on the South Pole, and these are not juggling balls, but snowballs. But personally, I prefer that the stories that I tell and the things I do are in some fundamental way true. At least from my limited point of view. I prefer my audience to have to suspend their disbelief sparingly. This is one tool to make my strange antics more real and relatable, which again I hope helps make me and make the audience experience me as authentic. It's the same way with this mythopoetic project. I talked in episode 1 about this being an imaginary exploration, and in a sense it is. But it is not a random brainstorming thing, what Coleridge called fancy. I believe that our project is based on the kind of imagination associated with creativity and the power to shape and unify what actually exists in the world. And I believe that the mythopoetic carnival can be viewed as a real thing. So a part of this exploration is to ground it in reality. And that's what last time when we talked about it from a philosophical point of view, we're going to talk about it today from a sort of evolutionary point of view, and I will also look at it in a more sociological way in another episode. But I also want to underline that what I'm doing here is merely discovering a setting or a world for mythic characters to inhabit, like the Norse gods, which we've spoken about before, and that was a particular interest, is a particular interest of mine. They had Asgard and Midgard and another 7 worlds, with Yggdrasil, the world tree growing from the middle of it all, but with its 9 roots, one going in, having its source in each one of the 9 worlds or realms, tying together everything. And the mythopoetic carnival is a place, and in this place, in this landscape, the fool, the strong woman, the tightrope walker are all inhabitants of this place. And myths are mostly about the goings-on between gods and heroes. This is not our current project. We're merely making the foundations or the cosmology or world building of this place. The landscape we are discovering and co-creating is a liminal space, but I do believe that this is a place that is more than simply made up. it is also in a very real way discovered. And last week, this week and ongoingly, we will look at this inner landscape from different points of view, like I just mentioned before. But I do believe that we are, apart from just using the imagination to find these things, we are actually onto something here which is a real thing in the world. But today I am going to have a look at this all from the point of view of evolution. Since my first introduction to evolution in biology class in year 12 at the Stein School in Haugesund, Norway, by teacher and now author Trond Skaftnesmo, evolution has resonated deeply with me. I think it's a fundamental insight into the nature of reality. It's a key piece to understand how processes behaves, and thus how so much of the world works, since so much, if not everything in existence, is a process and not a thing, which we've talked about before. And after having the evolution spark ignited in me by Trond, I moved on to reading the essay collections of Stephen Jay Gould before getting on to Richard Dawkins, whom we'll get back to a couple of times in the next bit, and then on to Darwin, whose pivotal work, The Origin of the Species, is a surprisingly good and easy read. It's essentially one gloriously well-crafted book-length argument guiding you towards the brilliance of his idea. And then I moved on to university texts, which were more of a slog, but great for more detailed analysis. Anyway, to understand the origins of anything, like species, flowers, or, as we will see, cultural phenomena like burial rites, fashion, or, for our purposes here, carnival attractions, evolution is for me a most powerful and salient tool. Everything is in change. Most of the things we care about aren't things, they're processes. Showmanship is a process, which we talked about in episode 8, called Where's My Art? Processes changes over time. Everything changes over time. As humans, we change, and further, we actively change things around us over time. We've shaped dogs into peculiar and ever more cute or fierce breeds. Cows have been bred to have vastly greater milk yields. And this kind of evolution, this kind of development is called selective breeding or artificial selection. But as we have looked at, artificial just means done by humans for the benefit of humans. And the natural world also has a way of selecting, and this is called natural selection. And we'll dig into some of the details of that in a bit, but natural selection takes longer to happen, or what it does takes longer time, but it is no less effective than our artificial selection. For instance, in about 50 million years, natural selection has turned a pointy-snouted dog-like animal about 1 to 2 meters long, reaching about up to our knees when on all four. That was called Pachycetus. It's morphed that slowly over time, not from one breed of dog into another one, but the Pachycetus dog-like animal has now become what we know as whales. Imagine that. Dog, 4 legs, snout, tail, now 30-meter long blue whale. What a transformation. Dog to whale. This is totally worth checking out if you haven't. It's one of those most well-documented, remarkable examples of evolutionary history where we just have an incredible collection of fossils that shows the one linking into the next. I'll post a link to a documentary episode on YouTube that talks about this, and it's very fascinating, worth looking into. But the idea that the natural world is in constant flux is not really something I need to argue. I think it's self-evident. This pandemic and the ensuing annihilation of our entire industry of showmanship is proof of this ongoing change on every level of biology with the virus and culture with the consequences it has on us. I also don't think that I need to argue for the fact that this process of change in living organism is governed by the process of evolution. I think if you're doubting evolution, I can't help you here on this podcast. I would recommend you seek some professional help, because this relatively simple theory impacts everything, as Theodosius Dobzhansky famously put it. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And as we go on here, we will also see that this might be true for culture as well. So let's start looking at the shapes of life and how it has changed through time. But before we go any further, let's have a quick refresher look at biological evolution. Evolution is the process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable physical or behavioral traits. And that's a bit of a mouthful. Evolution is the process by which organisms change over time as a result of the changes that are happening in heritable physical traits or behavioral traits. So let's just unpack that a little bit, because that is really all it is. It contains most of it there. So there are 4 principles that work in evolution. They are variation, selection, inheritance, and time. No offspring is identical to their parents. That's variation. You're not exactly the same as your parents. And no animal has a baby that's exact replicates of themselves. And for now, that's all we need to know. Any variation, random or otherwise, that makes certain organisms better suited to their environment than others. That change could be body shape or cognitive ability or anything like that, that can increase an individual's chances of survival. The process of who survives, that we call that selection. If you're well adapted to your environment, you survive. If not, you don't. Any advantage in survival, such as longer necks in the proto-giraffes or in the brontosaurus, that gave them access to more food in regions other animals couldn't reach, that could potentially increase their chance of surviving and thus having more babies. And as long as the beneficial trait can be passed from parent to offspring, then the next generation will arrive with that same advantage. This is the principle of inheritance. So there's the first 3, and finally all of this, like everything under the sun, is unfolding in time. We meet each other, we have babies, they grow up, all of this happens in time. Evolution is, in a sense, the unfolding of the shapes of life through time, where there's a constant flux of life going through. And of course, from us as individuals, it feels like my journey begins at birth and ends at death, or whatever one might think about that. But in real life, the shape of life goes through us. Anyway, let's look a little bit closer at inheritance. The fundamental element of biological evolution is a gene. This is the thing which makes it possible for us to inherit the traits of our ancestors. A gene is made up of DNA, and that's all we need to say about that. You won't be expected to know anything more for the test. But those of you who remember anything from a biology class at school might remember that language, burial rites, and carnival attractions are not considered living beings. Hence, they have no DNA. So, you might ask, is this where this analogy falls apart? Can we really use the theory of evolution to talk about carnival attractions? Yes, we can. Circus acts are cultural phenomena, as opposed to biological phenomena, hence no genes. But genes aren't the only kind of replicators. In 1976, the year I was born, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins came up with the concept of a meme. A meme is for cultural phenomena what DNA is for a biological organism. These days, a meme is most commonly thought of as a picture of a cat or sweet baby Yoda with a funny slogan. But when it was coined, it was posited as the unit for cultural content which can be passed from one person to another, analogious to the unit of biological heredity. Memes spread through culture like genes spread through the gene pool, with imitation replacing bodily reproduction. Monkey see, monkey do. Because a meme is an idea. It's a behavior or a style that spreads between people through imitation. Monkey see, monkey do. One person turns his cap around to be cool. Others see it, like it, think that's a cool guy, and they imitate it. Next thing you know, you have people wearing caps backwards all over the world. I saw a picture recently from a sporting event, and there were like 20 dudes just sitting in the row at a sporting thing. I don't know what it was, baseball or something, and all of them had their caps backwards, but they were facing into the sun, and every single one of them had his hand up to shade his eyes from the sun, yet they were all wearing the solution to that particular problem on their head. Yet the mimetic drift, how the cultural imitation of wearing the hat backwards, which is sort of similar to how genes drift, but that this drift had left the guys without any proper understanding of the true purpose of that hard brim that stuck out at the back of their hats. So, just like all genetic drift is not a positive thing, it is the same with mimetic drift. Sometimes the changes in styles are not because it's necessarily better. But any phenomena as simple as a hat worn in a particular way, or as a complex as a religion, can beneficially be thought of as a meme. They're self-replicating ideas. The memes that survive are the ones which manage to spread themselves. And religions are strong replicators, and partly this is because they have a built-in feature aimed explicitly at spreading themselves. Proselytizing, like missionary work, is a feature of most, if not all, religions, and this gives them a viral power, like Jehovah's Witnesses coming and knocking on your door, or as I discovered in Las Vegas, Mormons as well go door to door to spread their memes. And it doesn't take much imagination to see this link between proselytizing and a gene's function of heredity. In episode 9, which is part 1 of the mythic poetic explorations, I sort of tentatively argued that creating cultural and real-world artifacts or idea creations, that this is part of natural human behavior. And I likened it to the making of a bird's nest. And I was thinking about this, and then I was reminded of another concept coined by Richard Dawkins, namely what he calls the extended phenotype. It's a fancy name, and a phenotype is basically the individual of a species like you and me, and we're both kind of expressions of the interactions between our genes and the environment. It's like our inner landscape meeting the outer landscape in some conversation. But what Dawkins proposed in this 1982 book was that things like birds' nests are an extension of the phenotype. It's an extension of ourselves. And he was talking of things like beaver dams, but also birds' nests. So he claims these are as much part of the individuals and the individual beings as any other natural behavior like eating or avoiding being eaten by a wolf. And there's a little quote from him saying that an extended phenotype is one that is not limited to the individual's body in which a gene is housed. That is, it includes all the effects that a gene causes on the world. So this, to me, is a kind of backup of this argument that cultural creations are part of natural biology, and perhaps not identical, but certainly closely related. So that's another way to sort of using evolution to pin one more peg on our the mythic Carnival's canvas, peg it into the ground and make it stick, make it real. So now, let's take a quick look at a different kind of biological selection process. Because natural selection, as we just briefly sort of touched on, is based on who survives. And there's another thing, and this is where we're going to talk a little bit about sexy peacocks. Because just after Darwin wrote his book on the origin of the species in 1859, which had a subtitle, very long subtitle, but it was basically, says, by the means of origin of the species by means of natural selection. Then just a year after, he wrote in a letter to a woman called Asa Gray in 1860, he said, and it's just a very short sentence, he says, "The sight of a peacock feather makes me sick." And this, at first glance, is a peculiar statement. I, like most people, find just the opposite to be true. Delight is a more apt description of my emotional encounters with peacock tails. I'd say I feel delighted even when I see the much less decorated peacock hen. For Darwin, it wasn't really the sight of the feather itself which was so repugnant, but it was how it failed to conform to his idea of natural selection. The myriad of eyes on the tail, they stared back at him, challenging the natural order and defiantly refusing to drop its gaze. The tail was a grain of sand in Darwin's eye, threatening not to completely knock out his theory, but goading him with the fact that there were still things he didn't understand. And the word irritant here in the eye, it reminds me of when we talked about pearls in episode 9, and in a way the peacock tail could be seen as the grain of sand irritant that triggers the creation of a pearl in an oyster. The pearl is a treasure, but not to the oyster, but for humans. If the tail is the irritant, then the treasure is the insight it eventually would bring Darwin. Because the extravagant tail, which can stand 5 feet tall on a peacock, didn't seem to aid the peacock's survival, which is the be-all and end-all for natural selection. The tail's overgrown size would be a direct hindrance in flight. How could it exist when the sheer weight and size of the tail would just aid the predator chasing the peacock rather than the peacocks themselves? Darwin was sickened by what lay behind the visual display, the mockery the tail made of his powerful insight of natural selection. The tail was a mystery. It simply shouldn't exist. What could possibly justify the existence of the tail? And after much consternation and studying of things like staghorn beetles, which have completely outsized horns which they don't really use for fighting, he came upon the answer. Chicks dig it. Or in the case of the peacocks, it wasn't so much the chicks but the hens. The peacock hens dig it. And he called this sexual selection. And it is an entirely different kind of selection process. Natural selection is really a survival selection. The one who survives can get on with having kids and thus have their lineage preserved for eternity. If you survive, you live, which is a prerequisite for procreation, and if you die, you don't live, and procreation is unlikely. The great arbiter of natural or survival selection is death. The arbiter of sexual selection is the female of the species and her choice of mate. If she likes what she sees, she might allow the male to mate with her. There is a plethora of ways to get the female to like them, and these strategies have evolved into some of the most elaborate behavioral creations in the animal kingdom, like the elaborate dance displays of the birds of paradise, the artful nests or bowers that are being created by the bowerbirds, and also the ostentatious tail of the peacock. In the human race, we could imagine the male punk's yellow mohawk and leather jacket with the safety pins just placed just right, and tartan pants ripped and patched in just the way she likes it, the female punk might allow the male punk a chance to mate with her. The Victorians, Darwin's contemporary humans, were rather displeased with this idea that women played such a supremely important role, as pivotal as death, in shaping how men looked and behaved and how species evolved. The idea was abhorrent, since at the time women were not considered smart and important enough to be trusted to vote responsibly. From a very limited and obscure point of view, you can say that certain aspects of men, their physicality, but also part of their behavior, is this way because females fancied it in the past. And this is meant strictly in a biological sense, as male behavior towards women is an angry wasp's nest that I don't want to get into. I just want to stay well clear of. And to be clear here, I'm not blaming my own shortcomings and inadequacies physically or behaviorally on the female of the species. For these I take full responsibility. Now, for now, it's enough to say that living things, and by extension cultural things, go through and are shaped by selection processes, including but not limited to sexual and natural selection. With that refresher of biology and selection out of the way, let's have a look at these ideas of selection and shine their spotlight of illumination onto carnival attractions and see what we learn. So we'll look at some selection along the midway. The mythopoetic carnival has many attractions, and not all of them are equally able to capture the attention and interests of carnival patrons. Not everyone will buy tickets to every attraction. Some attractions are more attractive than others. Let's imagine this process along the mythic midway. We walk along the sawdust and gravel-covered path and see long lines of patrons buying tickets for the Ferris wheel. Next to it, there is another attraction with hardly anyone buying tickets. Let's say this is for a pygmy village. The difference in lineup for tickets is selection in action. Whether the selection is sexual or natural is maybe a question for another time. But the pygmy village, which was a thing at the Chicago World Fair in 1893, was still an attraction when my friend and collaborator Hamish McCormick's father went to an agricultural fair in Australia when he was young. And as he remembered it, it was just a few short Africans sitting in an enclosure, every now and then getting up to bum a cigarette from someone in the crowd. Now, in our mythopoetic carnival, if the ticket line was permanently short, the pygmy attraction would eventually disappear due to a lack of interest or due to a lack of resonance with the mythic carnival patrons. It doesn't matter what the reason for this failing to capture the hearts and minds and attentions of the crowds is. The point is that the Ferris wheel, which was first exhibited at the Chicago World Fair 1893, continues to have long lines today. You can expect an hour of queuing up to get onto the London Eye. And when I went to the similar sort of big wheel at the Winter Wonderland in Hyde Park, also in London, a few years ago, it was the same thing, huge lines up. And the wheel has captured something in our imagination. There is a resonance between something inside us and the wheel. Carnivals has existed for a very long time. The exact origins are somewhere in our deep history. And at what time does the carnival become a carnival? That's like asking, when did a fox become a fox and was not the animal that it was before or after? But as far back as people have gathered in groups, I think there's been showmen presenting their tricks. Exactly how a single attraction of performances has evolved into a carnival in general, or to the midway at the Chicago World Fair, is a topic we can look into in a later chat. But it bears similarity to the evolution of a single-celled organism into a multi-celled organism, and perhaps even the proliferation of mammals following the extinction of the dinosaurs, maybe. But even if we just look at the evolution of these shows from the midway in 1893 and onwards, certain attractions, the Ferris wheel and Little Egypt, which we talked about when we talked about a couple of episodes. She had these seductive dances and was one of the real attractions of the Midway in Chicago for the World Fair. But these kind of things, the girls on display and the Ferris wheel, has remained staples as carnival attractions, whilst the Pygmy Village, not so much. Now, we're looking at names, and that perhaps names and individuals aren't the core of these memes. Because the big wheel that I rode in Hyde Park did not carry Ferris's name. And although Little Egypt at one point was a particular woman, whose name apparently was Farida Mazar Spiropoulos, and I've actually found some footage of her that's been filmed by Edison, and I'll post a link to it. Anyway, I'm sure that when she needed a break from all the dancing, the show talker out the front, gathering the next crowd, would quickly just bestow the title of Little Egypt on some other girl. This is a feature of the most prevalent carnival attractions. They're not reliant on names. Girls removing their clothes and or dancing seductively sells tickets regardless of who it is. There will be a short tantalizing display on a small stage by the entrance, just raunchy enough to capture the imagination and desire to buy tickets. And although, someone famous would possibly pull bigger crowds, it is not necessary. The act itself is inherently interesting to human beings, or to a selection of them anyhow. The meme, the core of the act, goes beyond any individual. And the same goes for sword swallowing. If the Carnival Barker, as they call it in popular culture, if it tells you that someone is going to swallow a 25-inch razor-sharp cutlass sword, the name of that person is not what's going to sway you one way or the other as to whether you're going to buy a ticket. Nobody's thinking like, it's John Doe swallowing that cutlass sword. I don't want to see that. I like Henry Brown's cutlass swallow better, so I'll wait to see if I can see him on another carnival. The Cooch Show, as girl shows were called on carnivals, is a feature of the mythopoetic carnival. They are perhaps an example of sexual selection, I don't know, but the way that they are presented is always at the whim of the popular imagination. Can be presented as strong warrior women of the Amazon or just hot girls nude. That all just depends on where and when they played, as well as the audience they want to or imagine they will be able to attract. The fortune teller, the strong man, the bearded lady, the fool, the carousel, the roller coaster and the Ferris wheel are staple attractions at the mythopoetic carnival, exactly because they have proven to resonate with carnival crowds. This is a likely way the mythopoetic carnival got its inhabitants, and possibly how the mental midway came to be. In real life, the patrons selected the attractions, and thus shaped the real-world midway by the way they spent their time, attention, and hard-earned cash. As to our inner midway, whether the attractions there exist because the carnival patrons bought tickets in the real world, and then by some osmosis they made it into archetypal attractions for our mental midway, or that the patrons bought the tickets in the real world because they felt it resonate with something inside them, is hard to know. Do people like real-world fools and fortune-tellers because it resonates with the archetype of the fool and fortune-teller already existing in our psyche? Was it the inner that attracted them to the outer manifestations, or was it the outer that leaked in and became the inner? Like the chicken and the egg, what came first is a complex question with possible mytho-poetic solutions for another time. The carnival is what it is and contains what it contains because it's systematically been subjected to selection pressures of different kinds, sexual, artificial and natural. Like how the peacock hen found a male peacock's tail attractive for long enough to shape it into the impressive display that it is today. In the same way, the carnival crowd's fascinations and resonance with certain attractions has shaped them into the staples of the Midway in a reciprocal process of interaction. The attractions at the mythopoetic carnival are displayed along the Midway because they mirror the inner landscape of humanity. In this way, the mythopoetic carnival is a reflection of our soul. It is the inner geography of humanity reflected back at us. The mythopoetic carnival is human nature revealed in participatory games and attractions. The carnival is a picture of the human soul. All right. Everything seems to be growing here. It's a fertile ground for our imaginative explorations and foundations of a carnival mythology. This is also something that I will be developing in the next season. There's just a few episodes left of this one, so if you think there's someone in your circle of friends, whether it be on Facebook or anywhere else that you think might be interested in this, then please point them in the direction of this. Post a link on your Facebook or scroll down, click 5 stars, write a review. But yeah, if you tell your friends that this exists and they like it, which as I see it is slowly and steadily growing, and I thank all of you who have pointed one friend towards this. There's only so much I can do in attracting people. But yeah, you can go over and read these things at my website, thewayoftheshowman.com, and you can, if you have anything to say in any way to me, then send me an email at thewayoftheshowman@gmail.com. And with that, all that's left to be said is take care of yourself and those you love, and I hope to see you all along the way.